video, you learned how to create your value scale out of pattern. So you should have filled in this whole top part where you practice hatching, cross hatching, and then you came up with two different values out of your own pattern that you came up with. Now we're ready to move on to the bottom and the back of the worksheet. For this, you're going to first begin drawing just your bug. But before you can begin, we need to make sure that we understand all of the vocabulary. Our first vocabulary term is contour. Contour is just a fancy way of saying the outlines. So the outlines of your drawing. Think of contour like a coloring book, where it only has outlines, but there's no value or any shading in when you first get it. That's what you want to do first whenever you create any drawing. You always want to just get those outlines or those contours, and then afterwards you can add all the value. This video will be all about how to create the contours. The next video is about how to then go about applying your value from your value scale up here into your contours to make it look like a nice finished bug. Alright, so to go about creating our contours, I first want to just use a technique called gridding. Gridding is where you break down your image so it's a little less complicated. Instead of having one huge image of a bug that's got lots of little parts, I will have many small little parts of the bug to make it a little bit easier on myself. To grid, you can use up to 4 steps. X, plus, diamond, and hashtag are those 4 steps. Make sure you write those down. We're going to use those a lot. On our final bug, you are going to use all 4 of these steps. But for this demonstration and for this worksheet, we only need to use the first 2 steps, X and plus, because it's a very small image and we don't want to have a bunch of extra lines on there that we don't need. So that's where I'm going to begin with my X. I'd like to grab a ruler, so make sure you grab one from the ruler drawer in the back. And then I'm first going to create an X right on top of the image that I'm trying to redraw. My X should be going from each little corner all the way to the edge, and I like to do this in pencil so that I can go back and erase it later. Gridding is just a tool. It's not supposed to be there on your final image. There's my X. Once I'm done with my X, the X will tell me where the very middle of my image is. From that middle image, I now can create a plus going all the way from the top to the bottom, and then all the way from the left to the right. Now, instead of having one large image of a bug, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 smaller triangular images of my bug, so I can just break it down and do a little bit at a time. I have my grid on here, but I also need to have my grid on the paper that I'm going to be drawing on. So, very lightly with a pencil so I can erase it later. I'm going to first create my X. It's very important that you do the gridding steps in order, or else they can easily get messed up because they build on top of each other. So I have my X. I find my middle point in that X. Create a line going up and down for my plus, and then a line going side to side to finish off my plus. Notice I did it very lightly so I can erase it later. Now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different smaller parts of my paper that match up with my bug and how I divided the bug up. Now that I have my grid on there, I'm ready to actually begin drawing my contours. When drawing your contours, you can take this a couple different ways. Some people like to choose to just focus on one part of the image at a time. So, for example, I could just focus on 1, the number 1 little triangle there, and begin drawing what I see in number 1 in this number 1 triangle over here. So I would just be drawing this shape for now, and that's about it. And a little bit of this, and then I would move on to number 2. So you're just breaking it down into smaller parts. That's one way to do it. I like to do it a little bit different. So instead of just doing one triangle at a time, I like to use my grid as guidelines in order to break my image down, simplify my image, and just know where different parts of the image go within this paper using the grid. Let me explain this a little bit further. Instead of looking at this image like it's this really complicated book, I'm going to try and change my thoughts into thinking of this image as more simple shapes. So I could look at the head and think that it looks almost like an oval. These little parts look like long triangles. Down here just looks like a rectangle. If I think of my bug in simple shapes like that, or if I think of any image in simple shapes like that, it makes it a little bit easier to try and begin drawing over here. And then I can add those details later. So I'm first going to approach the head as that oval. I can make little guidelines for myself to see where the head meets, and then I want to try and recreate those guidelines over here. So I notice that the head meets right on this line where it goes from 7 to 8, and I'm going to make a little mark there. The top of the head goes right underneath where that middle mark is, and then it comes over here on the 5 to 6 mark, and then it comes right about there on the 6 to 7 line. Once I have some of these guidelines, that makes it a lot easier for me to be able to draw the shape. After I have the shape lightly sketched in there, I'm ready to move on to my next simple shape. So I'm treating these almost like long, curved triangles. So I first want to find where the top of this little triangle will go. I can make some little guidelines to see about how far over it'll go. And it comes all the way down to over here. Now I can go ahead and start connecting those guidelines to create a general shape of that. Same thing over here. Make some little guidelines, mark it down, start filling them in. And finally I can approach this down at the bottom almost like it's a rectangle. I really just need one line there and one line there. I'm really using my guideline to determine where the lines and shapes are going. So I knew that this line is right inside of triangle 6, and I knew that it's not quite in the middle, a little bit off to the left. So that's how I knew where to put that line. Once I have these really basic shapes, now I'm ready to start moving into more details. So at this point, I can take it one triangle at a time, or I can continue making little guidelines. If I take it one triangle at a time, I would look into 2 and see that it's got this little guy in here. Same thing over here is in 3. It points out right before it goes into 4. I can start getting some details like this one, where it sticks up a little bit. So I'm really just using the guidelines of the grid to tell me where things are going. You notice it's got a little antenna that goes into 5, and then another one that stays in 8 the whole time and curves. And it's got some little highlights right over here. Remember, highlights are the lightest parts of the drawing where the light's reflecting, so those are little highlights. I want to outline all of those as well, so I'm not just outlining the main contours. I'm also outlining some of those value changes. the value changes right there. It's got a little highlight. That'll help me when I go in to make my values. Don't worry about the background. All I'm focusing on is the bug. You get a few more details on here, and then I'm ready to move on to my next video where we're going to talk about how to go about adding the value from your value scale onto your bug down here. Alright, keep going. Best of luck.